Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. It's race week once again, this time in China, and Adrian Newey has revealed that Red Bull are fast approaching the performance ceiling of their car, revealing they are seeing massive, diminishing returns and the upgrades to follow, with the fact that Ferrari are bringing a major upgrade to Imola, with more upgrades on the way. Is it over yet in terms of the championship fight this season? Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. And as I say, we go to China. This is the track if you guys are unfamiliar. Lots has changed since we were here 5 years ago, in terms of a number of things with relation to the sport. One major thing though to note this weekend, of course, is that it is a sprint weekend. We do one practice session on the Friday, then straight into sprint qualifying. So just to break this down, because there's been lots of different sprint formats over the last couple of years, so I'll just go through what it is nowadays. So Friday you get one practice session, then straight into sprint qualifying for the sprint on Saturday, instead of what it was last year with qualifying for the race on Friday, then Saturday was a standalone sprint day. Now it's sprint quali on the Friday afternoon. That sets the grid for the sprint on Saturday morning. Then you get points, of course, for top 8 in the sprint. And what you really need to do is not crash, because if you crash or if there are issues in the sprint, then you can't qualify for the race. Well, unless your car gets fixed in time on the Saturday afternoon. The key point to note is that between the sprint and the qualifying session, this was rumoured. Now this has been effectively confirmed. Andrew Chauvelin mentioned it in a Mercedes video the other day that there is going to be another Parc Ferme. So after FP1, as soon as sprint qualifying starts, your car, whatever setups they've chosen, that is locked in for sprint quali and for the sprint itself. But the crucial thing is, and one of the reasons why I think the sprints have been so dead for the last couple of years, is that after FP1, the car setup is locked in. There's very many talented guys that can't do anything because they've decided the setup. They might have got it wrong, they might have got it right, but that's what they're stuck with for the weekend, apart from some small tweaks to tyre pressures, front wing, stuff like this they can change. Apart from that, they can't do anything else. Not the case nowadays. After the sprint, if some teams struggle with tyre deg or various other things, they can change the setup of their car for qualifying and for the Grand Prix. So I'm very hopeful that that creates something more interesting when what we see in the sprints, as in Max Verstappen rides off into the distance and wins, isn't necessarily what we see in the Grand Prix. Although Max Verstappen will likely drive off into the distance and win, it's not necessarily as guaranteed as it was previously, because the sprint was basically a preview of the race before, and it probably will still be the case, but it does open the door to other teams actually improving their car when it comes to quali and the real race on the Sunday. So I think this is better. Will it be great? I don't know, but I think certainly there will be some element of chaos, because we have not been to China in 5 years, and as Max Verstappen says from a driver and a team PFE, this makes no sense. It's not great to do that. As he says, let's say it like that rather than being slightly more harsh, because when you're a bit away from the track for quite a while, I think you never know what you're going to experience, right? But on the other hand, it probably spices things up a bit more, and that's maybe what they would like to see. So yeah, I think that Max is right. That my feeling is that they have made the decision to make China a sprint race because it adds chaos, it adds uncertainty. It makes it more likely the Red Bull might not hit the ground running and dominate. But even if they don't have the setup perfect to a sprint quali in the sprint, then they can change it for quali and the race from the Sunday side. Purely from a driving PFE performance perspective of the sport, I think it is not the smartest thing to do to run a sprint this weekend. That's what they're going to do. Max Verstappen, of course, was racing with Pierre Gasly last time they were in China several years ago. Checo was at Racing Point. Red Bull hadn't won a race with Honda yet. Of course, also the circuit of Red Bull's first ever victory in Formula 1 in the hands of Sebastian Vettel way back, I believe, in 2009, of course, after Vettel got a win with Toro Rosso at Monza. Lots of upgrades, though, coming, and we'll certainly discuss the relevance of this in a second when we're talking Ferrari versus Red Bull and potentially other teams as well. But Haas, they have close ties with Ferrari. They are bringing upgrades. Komatsu even says Gene Haas is willing to invest in the team, but as long as the money isn't wasted, which is maybe a bit of a dig at the way that Günther Steiner's operation was previously running. But they are bringing upgrades this weekend, not just in China, also in Imola and in further circuits to come. And Haas is saying, at least the belief is, there is a significant step on the way here. Like, I can't believe this alternate reality I'm living through, with Haas bringing several upgrades in the upcoming rounds. They will start with their upgrade on Magnussen's car, which is kind of interesting because Hülkenberg has more points and has been the stronger driver, but they're going to do that in China. And Komatsu saying, yeah, we want to be aggressive with the development, keep making steps. So if Haas are making steps, you've got to think Ferrari have some steps in the works as well, based on the similarities in lots of the parts of their car, and that is also also the rumour. It was discussed the other day that Ferrari have 3 major upgrades on the works this season. Probably one for Imola, probably one for like Silverstone time is usually when a second upgrade arrives, and then one towards the end of the season in like, you know, an Austin or something like that. Depends on the calendar, but those are some of the circuits where often upgrades are brought. And we talked about the other day that Ferrari's upgrade is, well, pretty substantial for Imola, and they think it's going to give them, you know, 2-3 tenths of a second, if not potentially a bit more. And that is relevant when we discuss their proximity to Red Bull in a couple of minutes' time. So Haas are going to bring several upgrades. They believe it's going to work. This is also kind of crazy as well. They are faster, Haas, on track than their simulator says they will be, which is a problem, you know, fundamentally, because you want your simulator to be accurate, right? If your simulator isn't telling you the truth, that's a bit concerning, but still, it's better to be this way than the Mercedes way. That's kind of what was pretty funny, is that Mercedes are effectively catching strays because their sim tells them they're going to be rapid and they're not, whereas Haas, their sim told them that, yeah, they weren't going to be looking so good. That's why Komatsu is saying, yeah, probably we're going to be 10th fastest in Bahrain. They're not. They're quicker than that, and apparently they're going to get even faster. One team they may start to very much compete with or even overtake potentially if their upgrades in China work could be RB, especially in the hands of Daniel Ricciardo. He has been struggling so far this season, and Ricciardo says, look, people will forget about the poor start to the season if I just have a couple of good races, which is possibly true, and he has a new chassis for China as well, because he said, look guys, give me a new chassis just so I can make sure that that is a variable not in consideration. But actually RB shuts down the rumours around Daniel Ricciardo's ultimatum. You guys might remember that I think it was the New Zealand Herald reported that Ricciardo had been given an ultimatum to say, look, improve in the next couple of races or you're fired, and Liam Lawson's getting the seat. Maybe you can understand why the New Zealand Herald, you know, Lawson's a Kiwi, that might make some sense. But RB's CEO Peter Bayer says, no, that's not true. We want to support Ricciardo because the car works within a relatively small marginal limit range. Daniel has problems, especially with the brakes, which is actually very interesting because Ricciardo's key strength, of course, as many know, last the late breakers, the Red Bull has historically, and remains true to this day, been very strong on the brakes. That was the car, and even the Renault to some degree, but that was the car that Daniel Ricciardo could really get the most out of by braking later than anybody else could manage. The recent cars he's driven, the McLaren and now seemingly the RB, have problems with his braking style, and it was discussed at length in his McLaren stint why his driving style, and especially the way he uses the brakes, just doesn't work with the McLaren, and it seems to be affecting him again here with the RB. So unless he can adapt quickly, which I'm not sure he can, because look, we've seen what happens with Ricciardo in a McLaren and in a, you know, Toro Rosso for the last couple of years now, and the trend has been relatively similar. Now elsewhere in the driver market, let's say Ricciardo was to, you know, be forced into retirement or something, go to IndyCar or go somewhere else, there are 2 names that are in the conversation somewhat on the outskirts. Those are Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. Now, Bruno Faman says, oh, they're happy guys. Yeah, don't worry, they're loving life at Alpine. And maybe there's a very tiny element of truth to this, but the reality is, if you're a competitive racing driver and your car and team are terrible, you ain't going to be happy. It doesn't matter what your team principal says, you're not going to be a happy bunny. So yeah, apparently Ocon and Gasly are perfectly happy with the team, but I somewhat doubt that. And actually, Alpine are even saying that the driver market is rather high risk because their car is bad. I'm sure that both of these guys would be very much interested in a move to a better team somewhere else on the grid, and apparently Ocon is the more likely of the 2 to make that happen. I think that Gasly did a very commendable job against Ocon last year, but this year so far, Ocon has had his number, there's no doubt. And rumour has it that there's interest in Ocon from teams beyond Alpine, so I guess you can wonder which teams they might be. The best possible seat available still would be the Mercedes seat, and there is a connection there, but I just don't see why that would make sense of Mercedes, to be honest, given the circumstances. Aston Martin, of course, as well, is always going to be a conversation with Aston Martin's contract extension with Alonso as to whether Stroll is going to stay, because given the fact that they're doing the WEC project, the WEC project with the Valkyrie, it feels like a step for Lance Stroll into, you know, the Endurance Championship. Probably will happen at some point, maybe once, you know, the F1 dream has maybe died, but the F1 dream will remain as long as Lance Stroll wants it to, because despite Honda's arrival, reports suggest that Aston will keep Lance Stroll. Apparently his technical feedback is cited as a key strength. I think there's probably another reason why he's maintaining the seat rather than his great technical feedback, but I can't quite put my finger on what that might actually be. Just quickly on Williams as well, because this was reported yesterday that Williams are looking to replace Logan Sargent, or at least exploring alternatives to Sargent in the car. Now, this really should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody. It does feel a bit bad for Logan on some level, and I know that people are saying, well, you know, last year was kind of like his first year, rookie year, testing year. This year he's had a difficult time. They've dragged him out of the car. They've not treated him with the respect that he deserves, and I get that angle, but then again, we live in a competitive sport. We live in a world that isn't necessarily fair, and has Sargent been fast? No. Has he been a safe driver that doesn't crash? No. Like, on both counts, Sargent has failed. Banning qualifying with respect to Albon, puts the car in the wall, slow race pace, barely scoring any points. Like, you know, I don't mean to trash him too hard, but like, to me, that's not Formula 1 level. There's other drivers out there that could do a better job. So I don't think it's a hot take to say that Williams should replace Sargent. I think they should have done it last year. And at this point, he probably only has a few races to convince James Vowles otherwise, or they will get rid of him, or potentially that decision is already made, because just the way they treated him after the Albon crash in Australia kind of makes me feel like there is really no confidence remaining that Sargent's going to be their future driver. And there are other options for Williams. There's plenty of good drivers that might need seats. There's also the Antonelli possibility if Mercedes want to make that happen, if they were to, let's say, sign Carlos Sainz for a season or two, depending how things go over the next few weeks, I suppose, in the driver market. And just before we discuss the Red Bull situation, these are the China 2024 quali and race simulations. Now, these maybe aren't too far away from reality because they do align somewhat with what we have seen so far. Questions to me on where McLaren will be, even rumours that Haas might be the 6th fastest team. This is quali sim, this is race sim, which is not too dissimilar in some ways, but it's Ferrari, at least according to big data, that are going to be within a couple of tenths of Red Bull. Everyone else is going to be significantly further back. And honestly, if you look at straight line speed performance of teams like Mercedes and McLaren, especially DRS and stuff like this, it's not going to be pretty for them. They probably are going to lose a fair bit of time. So this is the theoretical race pace and qualifying simulations. But of course, the consistent trend is Ferrari by far the closest team to Red Bull, and Aston Martin, good in qualifying, not so strong in the Grand Prix as it stands. Now, Adrian Newey has been given lots of thoughts lately on Red Bull, on the car, on the team, on Max Verstappen and other things. But he goes into great detail here in this exclusive interview with motorsport.com on, and I'll leave everything linked down below if you guys want to check it out, on just the state of Formula 1 right now, what he would change. And it's good to see that Newey, you know, he's a sensible guy, very smart guy, and I think he says what a lot of us believe about the state of the sport. So he discusses the balance, right, between having a V10 that isn't necessarily fuel efficient and balancing the social responsibility. But as he says, the reality is the pollution caused by the sport is minimal, as is the case with basically every single sport. The biggest contribution to pollution is those who watch the games. But it's an image question as to why they do this, and noise is actually inefficiency. So, you know, maybe the V10s aren't the best, but I don't know, bring it back as far as I'm concerned. So Newey kind of discusses the trade-off there between the regulations, and there's just all sorts of different parties and stakeholders and interests that are trying to align, and I don't think Formula 1 does the best job of really executing on that, and it's a difficult thing to achieve. But he does also discuss you've got to make the cars fast. The cars, in his opinion, need to be smaller, lighter. The cars have become very big. These are the fundamental elements. They need to look fast on TV. To make the sport entertaining and to look fast on TV, they've got to be very fast in reality. So he goes on to kind of discuss, you know, the integral conflict between... So he goes on to discuss the inherent conflict between the teams want to just produce a result, a 1-2, which may be boring. There are, you know, producing an entertaining victory doesn't bring any more points, whereas the sport wants something otherwise. And he says, look, unless you make it artificial like the WWE, that's probably not going to happen. The reality is the current regulations are probably the most restrictive we have ever had. Each new regulatory era tends to be more restrictive than the previous ones, and the cost cap was also introduced to limit the expenses of the larger teams compared to the smaller ones. Yet the order of competitiveness within the budget cap has not changed significantly. So interesting statement there, because kind of implying that he doesn't really believe the budget cap has done much, which I also kind of agree with. Now, maybe you want to say, give it time for the budget cap to take its effect, sure, but there's probably a reason why a team that starts out an era particularly strongly is not going to get caught up under the budget cap right now. And also the fact that the bigger teams, have more resources, therefore they have better factories, they have better facilities, and there's various other reasons why teams further down just can't necessarily catch up. So Newey seems to be somewhat concerned about that. But he finishes off with this on the state of the cars. With regard to the aero aspect, especially from 2022, the cars will be able to follow each other closely, but the single seaters have perhaps become very large. They are fast and heavy, and I think that's a bit of a shame, because something that can say over the years is that everything that F1 cars represent tends to be popularized in the showrooms. That's another important point, is the relevance of F1 to actual road cars. The paddle shifter, the flappy paddle gearbox or whatever, was born in F1. Now it's become very popular in road cars too. When turbo engines introduced in F1 in the 80s, then you saw more road cars with turbo engines. And that's kind of what he's saying, that what we're doing now with the hybrid units and these things that really don't have that much reality, because the way that a hybrid power unit is executed is very different in an F1 car to probably how it's going to be done in a road car. And he says, yeah, look, carbon fiber wings, most of the sports cars you see today have, some sort of active aero, as it were. So these things spill into the real world, and he would like to see that continuing onwards. What we tend to do is, above all, have an obsession with reducing emissions, perhaps through batteries or hydrogen, without using fossil fuels. But the most important thing for me is the amount of energy a car uses, because that's the key thing, which is a really interesting point, actually, that it doesn't really matter where the energy comes from if the car doesn't use much energy, or if it does, then that's problematic, right? So saying that even if the energy is from a wind turbine, it's not necessarily fully zero carbon. So his point is, look, let's get away from this idea of necessarily 100% using renewable energy for the cars, and instead say, how about we make the cars use less energy? So much smaller, much lighter, more aerodynamically efficient cars. That's the route that I would go down. Maybe that way we could start to change the situation compared to these 3-ton monsters destroying our roads by creating potholes. So even his point there is that the way that F1 has gone with the heavier cars is kind of inspiring road cars to be somewhat similar in some ways, and he feels like they should do it a different way. So I feel like he's on the money on this one. But what he also goes to say is on the Red Bull situation right now. He actually says the following on the current regulations. In our case, we are struggling to find the gains, if you like, in terms of our aero gains in percent per month or whatever, are flattening without doubt. This has been a question mark with Red Bull now for a rather long time. When will they get to the performance ceiling of their car? Because last year they brought upgrades, their car kept getting better. This year they brought a big step forward over every team that isn't Ferrari, which is very interesting, and they have some more to come, but they brought what was believed to be a relatively sizable upgrade that changed a fair few parts of their car in Japan. They got faster, they got maybe a tenth faster, and I'm sure they've got more to come for the Red Bull car, and of course obviously there's going to be the RB21 next year as well. But Newey being pretty forthright here that yeah, the car is reaching the performance ceiling. Now, is that effectively the perfect car? Because if Red Bull have found, and they seem to have found, the absolute best possible direction to take with these regulations, then they may be very close to perfection, at which point it's impossible to beat them. But if they are genuinely very near their performance ceiling, and he says, yeah, in terms of like percentage gain on a month-by-month basis, we're basically flatlining, we're pretty much flattening, and that of course opens the door, because if this Red Bull is almost as good as it's possibly going to be, it's not absolutely miles ahead of the competition. We see Ferrari, compared to last year, they have improved dramatically on every single track they've been to, and that may well continue. This was the data of the Japanese Grand Prix, F1pace.com, brilliant website by the way, I could just scour that page for hours, looking at all the different data. This was the data in Japan, so Sainz was 4/10 off Verstappen's pace. Now Leclerc was 9/10 off, but that was on a one-stop with way more tyre kind of management. When you account for that, it was more like 3/10, 3.5 really, with that considered. So the Ferrari was roughly 3.5, 4/10 off the pace of Max Verstappen and the Red Bull. Now, how much was Max leaving in the tank? I think that's always been the question. Sure, the Red Bull might be nearing its ceiling, but is the car actually at its ceiling right now when it's being driven? That is a matter for debate, and I do feel like Verstappen has more in the tank than he has shown. But then again, Australia, Sainz Leclerc very fast, and Perez was about half a second off. Now, yes, he had some damage, but it's just interesting to look at some of this data and consider if it's true that Ferrari are bringing an upgrade package in Imola worth 2 to 3/10 of a second, if it's true they have 2 more major upgrade packages on the go, and if it's true that Red Bull are basically at the limit of their car. It's not impossible that we have something of a championship fight this season if Verstappen has like 3 or 4 DNFs. I think that's going to be what it takes. It might be possible that for mid-season and beyond, Ferrari can actually compete with Red Bull. That's what Sainz believes. But probably by that time, Verstappen will have such a championship lead that it's not going to matter anyway. And even then, who knows? Because we talked about it last year and the year before that, well, by the end of the year, Red Bull probably won't be winning everything, but they still end up winning everything. Maybe this year won't be like that, and maybe Verstappen does just run away with it. But next year, as quite often can be the case, the final year of the regulations, we could have an absolute banger out, because if Ferrari continue to close up if they can, if Newey is telling the truth that their car is basically at the limit of what they can presently achieve, that does open the door to potentially an absolutely banger season with, Verstappen and +1 presumably in the Red Bull, and then Leclerc and Hamilton in the Ferrari to battle it out for the championship. So very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.